So this week's watercolour is a Fly Agaric. I wanted to paint this as soon as it started to feel a little bit more autumny because they're lovely. I was initially just going to do the mushroom on its own, but then I found this lovely picture on Pixabay and felt like I needed to do the background as well. So that is what I am attempting to do now. It was definitely more of a challenge with the background, and there are things that I would do differently next time. But if you want to watch along, have a go yourself, I will go over what I'm doing and how I created this little painting. So as you can see here, I'm just wetting the background with almost clean water and going around the mushroom, being careful not to go right the way over the little toadstool here, but working the water around because we don't want to cover the whole thing. I guess if you wanted to, you could use masking fluid to make sure you don't go over the mushroom, but I decided just to paint around it because it's fairly large, so it wasn't too difficult. I'm trying to use a limited palette again this time, and I am starting out with some Cobalt Blue and some Cadmium Red mixed together to make a bit of a purple, and I'm putting that in wet right the way across the background. Now I ended up going over this and making it darker later on because it dried a bit too light, so if you want to go in with a thicker consistency of paint or a darker colour in the background to begin with, that might save you some time later. And I decided for the trees in the background to try and do them wet, just to make sure it all looks nice and blended. Because these trees are in the background, they're going to be pretty faded in comparison to the foreground anyway. And for the trees, I used a mixture of Cobalt Blue and Cadmium Red, just in a darker tone really, so it looks more shadowy. And then I used some burnt Sienna as well for some of the more orangey trees, and just dropped them in, tried to do them in just one stroke, as you can see here. So this part is definitely about being brave, trying to do it in one go. It's easier if you can do it in one go. If you try and do it a little bit at a time, you risk putting too much paint down and it bleeding out into the background. So that was a challenge here, trying to get these trees as straight as possible first time around. So next I continued putting in the foreground, and I'm starting with a really light green, which I used lemon yellow and cobalt blue for this, with a touch of cadmium yellow. You could probably just do it with one yellow, but I used a mixture of two. To be honest, it had started to dry by this point, so there was a bit of a hard edge between the grass and the trees in the background. I think if I did it again, I'd try and make sure that all blended nicely and that it was still wet, so there was a nice soft edge between the trees and the grass, because that definitely led to a few issues later. I used Cobalt Blue, Cadmium Yellow and a little bit of Viridian Green for the foreground because it did have that nice Viridian Green to it, I guess. It had a nice rich green in there, so I used that, and this blended together much better with the lighter green in the background. I dragged a few bits of grass out into the background as well, but that worked much better and it was much softer for this area. I added in a few dark areas too, just to get a bit of shadow in that base layer. So for the next part, I am attempting to improve the background layer before moving on to the little Fly Agaric in the foreground. I began by putting in a darker shadow tone at the base of the trees just to try and connect them to the ground a little bit. By this point the background had started to dry, which led to me making a few other changes later. I'm going to go over some of the trees with some darker tones, so some burnt siennas and a bit of cobalt blue for the darker areas, just to make some of them stand out a little more and bring them further forward. And then once I had finished that and saw it dry, I decided to do a wash over the whole thing, which I'll go over in a little bit, but it was just to push it back into the background a little more because it was starting to look too divided between the highlights and the shadow sides of those distant trees. So here is where I took some drastic action and decided to put a wash over the background. I made sure that it was completely dry before I did this. Then I re-wet the part all the way down to the grass so that I could add in some paint. Some areas might not have been completely dry and they dragged out a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. And then I used some Cobalt Blue with a tiny little bit of Cadmium Red in there and maybe a touch of the Cadmium Yellow as well, just to grey it down a little bit. And then I put that over the entire background. It seems really dark here, but the idea really was for it to push everything back. The background was just a little bit too light and the foreground trees stood out too much, so the plan here was just to knock everything back. Could have probably used a larger brush for this to make it a little bit easier, and then I wouldn't have maybe disturbed so much paint in the background. But the idea here simply was just to push everything further into the background so that the little Fly Agaric, the mushroom at the front, is the thing that stands out the most. And then while everything was still wet, I used a thicker mixture of Cadmium Red and Cobalt Blue just to draw out some tree lines again. I didn't want to completely lose them to the background, I just wanted them to be a bit more blended and for the whole area just to be a bit darker and pushed further back into the painting. I'm lifting out with a clean damp brush some areas just to indicate a couple of highlights in the background, and because it's still wet that should bleed together and shouldn't be so obvious when it dries. So now to this lovely little mushroom, which was the purpose of this painting. I started out with some Cadmium Yellow to begin with, which did dry out quite nice and light, and I wasn't too fussed about this going over some of the little white spots on the mushroom because I didn't want them to be completely bright white. It would have just looked too out of place, so that cadmium yellow is the initial wash. And then for the rest of the top of this mushroom, I just added a little bit more cadmium red every time I wanted to darken the layer. I did it step by step. I wasn't waiting for it to dry completely, but because I wasn't using a lot of water in this, it wasn't too wet to begin with, so it didn't take too long between layers. And that's all I'm doing here, so I'm adding in a little bit more cadmium red every time I want to darken it up, keeping an eye on the reference photo and making sure that I follow it as much as I can, preserve highlights, work my way around the little spots on the mushroom. Again, you could use masking fluid if you wanted for this, or you could use acrylic or white gouache afterwards to put those highlights back in. But yep, just working step by step, following the reference photo. I'm also just softening edges as I go with clean water so everything's nice and blended out. I'm bearing in mind that the sunlight on this photo is coming from the right hand side of the picture. So the right hand side of this Fly Agaric is going to be the lightest side and my darkest shadows are going to be on the left. I'm also using darker tones around the bottom edge to try and indicate the shape a little bit, but just paying attention to the reference photo as I go and trying to be as accurate as possible. Underneath I used red and blue mixed together just to make a dark purple for the shadow side. I also went over some of the white spots on the underneath with some Cobalt Blue with the tiniest amount of red in there just to knock it back a little bit so it wasn't completely bright blue. And also just to tone down the white spots, because on the shadow side they would have been much darker. So I used that same purple shadow tone just to draw a line underneath the mushroom and along the left hand side, which would be the darkest side in this picture. And then I used the tiniest amount of water just to drag that shadow colour down, so that as it got further down it gradually got lighter and you got this really nice gradient effect, so it looks more realistic, I think. I added a little burnt sienna and potentially yellow ochre to the shadow tone and made it slightly lighter for the shadow coming up from the grass on the underneath, just so that that whole stalk is not completely white. I did a little bit of dry brushing to get some texture in there as well, and then darkened up the shadow on the top a little more. So I'm just making a few minor adjustments here, adding in some cadmium yellow and burnt sienna just to knock back some of the highlights a little bit and to try and make it look more realistic. I used some burnt sienna and some cobalt blue mixed together for some of the darkest areas on the top, just to add in a few spots of details, to add some more shadow tones underneath some of the little white spots on the mushroom as well. But just generally adding the finishing touches to this mushroom just to try and draw it together a little bit. For the foreground, I used some lemon yellow, cadmium yellow and a touch of cobalt blue just to darken some of the area on the lightest part of the painting, just to knock it back a touch. And then I used some dry brush techniques for the foreground with Viridian, Cobalt Blue and a touch of Cadmium Yellow, I think, but mostly Viridian and Cobalt Blue for the grass and the fir tree bits in the foreground. I'm using a slightly darker mixture of that green, that Viridian and Cobalt Blue, just to add some shadow details. And then I'm also going to add in some more details of the bits of pine tree which had fallen into the leaf litter on the floor. So I'm using burnt sienna, Cobalt Blue for the twigs, and then some Viridian Green and Cobalt Blue for the fir tree parts that I'm drawing out into the foreground as well, just to add a little bit more interest, so it's not just dry brush and nothing else. I'm adding in a layer of really dark Viridian and Cobalt Blue just as a shadow turn right away across the front. I darkened up the edge of the grass there just before it goes into the lighter section with some yellow ochre and cobalt blue, just a darker version of that grass that we already put down to break up that hard edge a little bit. And I think that is about it finished. So I'm just going to remove the masking tape now and then leave it as it is. And I am pretty happy with this tiny little toadstool. It's very sweet. I really like the mushroom itself. I like the shadow tones on there. I think if I did it again, I'd try to be a little bit more controlled with the washes in the background. But all in all, I'm fairly happy with it. I like the lighting in it. I hope you enjoyed this too. It was a nice change and nice to start off with something a bit more autumnal. I will be back again next Wednesday with another video, so thank you very much for watching and I will see you again then.